Hey folks, hope you all are doing well. I'm Karan Bandal from Econosite, and in this video, let's talk about the deficits when it comes to a nation's economy. To be specific, fiscal deficit and current account deficit. And by the end of the video, we'll also figure out the link between Indians working abroad and India's foreign exchange reserves. Now, fiscal deficit and current account deficit are the two critical terms in the realm of economics. They both indicate some deficit or gap in government's kitty. And it's important to understand these numbers as they provide insights into a nation's economic well-being. So let's start with the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is the difference between government's total expenditure and its total revenue during a fiscal year. The gap is covered through government borrowings. In other words, it is a measure of government's borrowing requirements. This metric is usually expressed as a percentage of a country's GDP. Simply put, when a government runs a fiscal deficit, it is spending more money than it brings in. Here's how India's fiscal deficit trend looks like. Since financial year 2013, India's fiscal deficit expressed as a share of its GDP was trending down. It clocked a low of 3.4% in financial year 2019. Then came the pandemic. Every major nation responded with massive stimulus spending. So did India. India's fiscal deficit skyrocketed to over 9% as a result. But as the economy began stabilizing after the pandemic shock, government managed to bring down the fiscal deficit methodically. By financial year 2026, projection for the fiscal deficit number is quite encouraging. See, this metric can have major implications on the nation's economy. Running persistently high fiscal deficits can lead to elevated inflation, higher interest rates, and economic instability. So it is vital for a government to keep a keen eye on this number. A downward trending fiscal deficit reflects positively on the government's ability to manage their finances in an efficient and sustainable manner. Next up is current account deficit or CAD. This is how India showcases its CAD. Let's explore India's current account deficit through the actual numbers from the financial year that ended in March 2023. In my view, the simplest way to explain current account deficit is this. It is the trade deficit plus transfers plus income. Let's start with the trade deficit first. Trade deficit is the difference between the value of imports and exports of goods and services. When a nation imports more goods and services than it exports, it enters a trade deficit. Take India's example from financial year 2023. India imported about $250 billion worth of goods more than it exported, registering a heavy trade deficit in goods. But the nation exported about $150 billion worth of services more than what it imported, registering a robust trade surplus in services. So overall, India's total trade deficit was around $120 billion. That means India imported more goods and services combined than it exported, about $120 billion worth. Key takeaways here are, first, India is overly reliant on other nations for its goods requirements. It makes sense since India imports about 85% of the oil it needs. And second, India's strength lies in services as evident by the high demand for Indian services globally. We see that in the numbers. India exports services like software services, financial services, business services, etc. more than what India imports by quite a margin. Though that margin is not enough to completely nullify its trade deficit in goods. Now when we add transfers and income to the trade deficit, we get India's current account deficit. You can see the definition of income on the screen. I'm more interested in transfers. Transfers are mostly made up of foreign remittances that Indians living abroad send back home. India has been topping the world in remittances for quite a while now. In fact, if you look at financial years 2023 and 2024, for the first time in history, India will have received over $100 billion in remittances each year back to back. Indians living abroad send money back home to support families, for education, for investment purposes, etc. Remittances play a key role in reducing India's current account deficit. So that brings us to India's current account deficit for financial year 2023 being around $67 billion. Does that mean India lost $67 billion from its forex reserves last fiscal? Well, not quite. There are two more pieces to the puzzle of the overall balance of payments. Current account deficit plus capital account plus adjustments equal overall balance of payments. Now adjustments are minimal, so let's focus on the capital account. Capital account basically represents the capital in terms of dollars being invested in India. If more dollars are being invested in India than that are leaving India, then there will be a surplus in the capital account. And that's exactly what we see for financial year 2023. India registered a surplus in foreign direct investments, loans, and banking capital. Also, banking capital surplus is driven by NRI deposits to a large extent. So a surplus of about $59 billion in India's capital account further reduces India's overall balance of payments to below $10 billion for the financial year 2023. And this is an anomaly. India has in fact registered a surplus more often than not in its balance of payments for at least the last 2 decades. So after reviewing these numbers, we can safely conclude that India has been consistently bringing in more dollars than what it sends out, at least since the early 2000s. And so, is there any surprise then that India has just hit another record high for its foreign exchange reserves? The reserves now stand at over $645 billion. India enjoys this favorable forex position on the back of 4 factors. Surplus in services exports, surplus in remittances sent back home by Indians working abroad, surplus in foreign direct investment, and a surplus in NRI deposits with the Indian banks. In summary, fiscal deficit relates to a government's budgetary situation, whereas current account deficit reveals the trade balance between a nation and the rest of the world. India's fiscal deficit seems to be moving in the right direction. India's current account deficit, however, can be improved. If India manages to move towards energy independence and succeeds in transforming its manufacturing sector, the nation can begin to see an outrageous amount of surplus in its balance of payments on a consistent basis. I hope you found this analysis interesting. I'll speak with you again next week. Until then, take care.